In the grand scheme of things, ECW didn't last for a long time. No, in truth, it only existed in its more famous incarnation for about 7 years between 1994 and 2001. But during that time, it hit so hard, it changed the landscape of the wrestling industry forever. Obviously then, during that run, there were a lot of great storylines to come out of Philadelphia. But what were the best of these? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the saga of Tommy Dreamer and Raven. Yes, this one may have been the greatest story Paul Heyman's Rebel group ever told. And the reason for that is it was the backbone to the entire promotion for a good part of its existence. How did it all start? Well, this happened back in 1995 when, angry about the fact that his former high school rival was starting to get over with fans, Scott Levy decided to take action into his own hands. That's right, the story here was that, in kayfabe at least, Raven and Tommy had been old high school cohorts. And it was during that time that Dreamer, being the jock, had bullied his future rival. So never letting go of this, Raven had taken the opportunity to get back at the New Yorker years later when they found themselves working in the same wrestling company. Interestingly though, while conventional logic here would have had Raven play the babyface, especially to the grungy 90s ECW audience, he was actually portrayed as the heel in the situation. Sure, this might have seemed like an odd move on the face of things, but in practice, it worked out gangbusters, as for the next 2 years, the pair would continually go at it, with the constant plot thread being Tommy's inability to score a win over his opponent. Seriously, it didn't matter what he did, and it didn't matter who else was introduced into the situation, whether that be Beulah McGillicuddy or someone else. Dreamer could never get the victory. That was, until he did, and on Raven's last night with the company to boot. Even then, though, the story wouldn't end because when Raven later returned to ECW for a brief spell, he'd now find himself part of an unlikely tag team with his old high school rival, with the two even becoming tag team champions together for a while. And they wouldn't be the only rivals who would find themselves teaming up from time to time, because the same dynamic was also there for our next great storyline of ECW, the rivalry between Rob Van Dam and Sabu. Now, in order to tell the entirety of this story, we must go all the way back to 1995, as that was when Rob Van Dam first joined the Philly-based promotion. And upon doing so, he would quickly make a name for himself with his innovative martial arts-infused high-flying style. But then, given he'd been trained by the legendary Sheik, it should go without saying that RVD was great. Of course, he wasn't the only man in the Extreme Championship Wrestling locker room who'd been trained by the Sheik though, because the same backstory could be applied to Sabu. So because both men came from such a similar background, it led to a friendly rivalry breaking out between them, a rivalry which eventually evolved into a friendship as both Mr. Monday Night and Sabu became one of the key acts of the promotion's tag team division. Yes, between 1996 and 1999, the pair could regularly be found tagging together. Not that this meant each didn't have singles aspirations though, and those aspirations would occasionally lead to the two coming to blows once more. When did this happen specifically? Well, one of the earliest incidents was May 1998's WrestlePalooza, and the reason a one-on-one bout was booked between the pair here was because at that point, Rob Van Dam was in the midst of his legendary run as television champion. Understandably then, Sabu wanted an opportunity to prove he could beat his partner and become a champion himself here. But while he was ultimately unable to do so, it wasn't like Rob beat him either, as the pair would end up going to a 30-minute time limit draw. So because of this, a rematch was always going to be needed to settle things. What most didn't realize at the time though was that it would take a full 2 years before that rematch occurred. That's right, after returning to working together for a while, it would be in January of 2000 at Guilty as Charged that the Dream Team came to blows once more. And this would prove to be the blow-off to their story together in ECW, as after Van Dam bested his opponent on that night, Sabu would be forced to leave the territory. Of course, when we're talking about great Sabu feuds in Extreme Championship Wrestling though, even this might not be the first one that comes to mind, as there might be an even greater one. Our next subject as it happens, the story of Sabu versus Taz. What made Sabu versus Taz so special? Well, how about the fact that it took a full 18 months between it started and the two finally meeting in the ring? Honestly, if you tried to do something like this with a modern audience that often has far less patience, it might get more of a backlash. But in the 90s, it was just about the hottest thing the Philly promotion had going, as everyone was desperately waiting for the inevitable to occur. Why was the build so long? Well, that was because after Sabu had no-showed an early ECW event in which he was meant to be tagging with Taz and got fired for a while as a result, the Red Hook native would take to venting his anger by calling out his rival at the end of every match. But with Sabu not being there was no one to answer the call. Hell, even when Sabu did come back to his home promotion, he still wouldn't acknowledge what Taz was doing. And that's the way things went all the way throughout 1995 and 1996, with Taz making the call and Sabu refusing to answer. This was until he did, of course. And in one of the true genius moves of the whole thing, once the lights went out and came back up to reveal that Sabu was standing in the ring with the man who had been wanting to fight him so much, they'd go right back down again as the two ran towards each other, meaning we still wouldn't get to see them touch. No, if we wanted to see that, we'd have to watch Barely Legal, ECW's first ever pay-per-view event. Needless to say then, once that event came and the match finally happened, the atmosphere was absolutely electric, and that meant there would be numerous opportunities for both men to do the match again as the years went on, with it getting better and better each time they did. Honestly, if we're talking about pure crowd heat, there's not a lot of things in Extreme Championship Wrestling's history that can top this one, as it was so nuclear at points, it made this small regional promotion feel like the biggest one in the world. But not every great storyline in ECW's history was about a feud between two men. No, sometimes it was about a feud between one man and the fan base themselves, as was the case in 1995 and early 1996 when Mick Foley went on an anti-hardcore crusade. Now, we all know that of all the great minds wrestling has given us over the years, Mick Foley ranks as one of the best, as he's such a creative guy, he was able to take anything and turn it into gold. But while a lot of his more famous work could be found in Attitude Era WWF, arguably his creative peak came during the mid-90s when he was working for Paul Heyman. Why was that? Well, this was the point that the man who was so well known by then for being a hardcore legend decided hardcore wrestling was no longer for him. Of course, there was a reason for this sudden character shift, and the reason was that, after working for ECW for a few months, Foley, both in character and in reality, began to grow disenfranchised with the bloodthirstiness of the fans there, with him feeling like all they wanted was for him to hurt himself for their entertainment, his safety be damned. And when you add to the fact that at one show, a fan would famously bring a sign which read Kane Dewey, with this being a reference to Mick's son, he decided enough was enough. Yes, if this was how the audience was going to treat him, then Mrs. Foley's baby boy wasn't going to give them what they wanted anymore. And that meant instead of doing his usual deathmatch antics, he would wrestle a far more traditional style, one which involved less chair shots and more drop toe holds and headlocks. Obviously then, this made him a mega heel in the eyes of the Philly faithful, and Mick would use that hatred to fuel his new character even further when he started coming out to the ring and praising enemy promotions like WWF and WCW for the more professional and safe way that they did business. Truly, this was a brilliant story, and one which showed just how great Mick Foley could be when the reins were taken off him. Hell, so good would it be, it would eventually see him be courted by WWF, as in early 1996, Vince McMahon would begin the process of signing him up to a contract. And you all know what happened after that. Mick became Mankind, and Mankind became one of the biggest stars of the Attitude Era. Would this have happened had he not first gone anti-hardcore in ECW? It's hard to say, but it certainly didn't hurt. And it all just added to the legacy of the New Yorker being one of the best creative minds the wrestling industry had at the time. Of course, this wouldn't be the only time in ECW someone targeted the fans for their love of hardcore wrestling, though. No, the same thing would happen not long after in 1997 when Jerry "The King" Lawler invaded the ECW arena. What a great angle this was. After all, while he might have first gained fame as the King of Memphis Wrestling back during the Old Territory days, by the time the mid to late 90s came around, Jerry Lawler was very much seen as being a WWF guy, as he'd worked there for so long as a commentator. So when he showed up as a surprise in Philly as part of the ongoing working relationship between ECW and WWF, it got nuclear heat to say the least. Yes, the fans in attendance that night were vicious in their hatred of the King, with them raining down vitriol on him in a way only they could, all while he stood there and trashed them by saying things like, "This place ought to be built out of toilet paper because there's nothing in it but crap." What was the blow-off to this moment? Well, it would be Lawler working 2 matches for the company, with the first being a 6-man tag at July 1997's Heatwave, which saw him team with Sabu and Rob Van Dam to defeat Rick Rude, the Sandman, and Tommy Dreamer, and the second seeing him do the job for Tommy Dreamer in a singles bout 1 month later at Hardcore Heaven. Aside from that, the ECW roster would return the favor when they themselves invaded Raw in the summer of that same year. Sure, it wouldn't be the longest-lasting storyline, as by the time the autumn came, it was all but over, but that said, it made so much of an impact while it existed that it's still being talked about today. But let's move away from WWF invasions for a moment and back to straight one-on-one feuds, as it's there we find our next great ECW storyline, the one that took place between Raven and the Sandman. That's right, Raven's epic rivalry with Tommy Dreamer wasn't the only great one he had in Philadelphia, because while in the midst of that, he was also locked in a deep beef with the Sandman. And this was one that would get so personal at points, it even involved the babyface's family. How did the family get involved? Well, after Raven beat the Sandman for the ECW World title at June 1996's Hardcore Heaven, he decided to continue playing mind games with the now former champ so as to further get in his head. And in true Raven style, this meant going hard on his rival by bringing his son onto the show and apparently brainwashing him to come to his side instead. Yes, in a moment which blurred the lines between reality and fiction for many at the time, we now had a situation where the Sandman's own child was turning his back on him. Obviously, this created a lot of heat then, but no one could have foreseen just how far that heat would take things in the long run and how much of an uproar it would cause with fans. Why did this feud ultimately cause such an uproar? Well, that was because it was at the company's High Incident show in October of 1996 that Raven famously crucified his rival in the middle of the arena. Needless to say, then, this was a highly controversial move. And it also had the knock-on effect of scaring Kurt Angle, someone who was there that night backstage, off from signing with the promotion and instead later going over to WWF. And it wouldn't be the last time ECW made such a bold move which got people to notice what he was doing either, as it was a year earlier in the autumn of 1995 that they made the far less controversial but equally as bold move to put the world title on Mikey Whipwreck. Now, to say that Mikey Whipwreck was an underdog back during the mid-90s would be an understatement, because with his diminutive size, no one was ever going to peg him for being a main event force, even in the land of misfits that was Extreme Championship Wrestling. But in the end, it was exactly this underdog status which led to Paul Heyman realizing there was such a great story to be told with him going all the way to the top of the mountain. Sure, Heyman isn't the only person who's done the underdog world champion story over the years. No, just about every company out there has tried it at some point. But surely this has to rank as one of the most effective versions of the angle, mostly because Mikey was great at playing the guy who fans could get behind and see themselves in. And that meant when, after a few months of failing and trying, he finally beat the Sandman for the gold on October 31st, 1995, the live crowd went wild as they'd seen something they thought would never happen. But of course, as we all know, every great story has to have a follow-up. And it was the follow-up which really made this one legendary, as that would see Whipwreck then go on to defend his newly won title in a feud with none other than Steve Austin. That's right, before he was stone cold, the Rattlesnake was serving a brief spell over in Philly where he was playing the heel foil to this new champion. And in true Austin fashion, he was smart enough to realize that the way to really get Mikey Whipwreck over to that next level wasn't for him to beat him as Paul Heyman initially envisioned. No, it was for him to ultimately do the job to the fan favorite and make him feel like a bigger star as a result. Did this work? Of course it did. And it all only added to the greatness of the Whipwreck as world champion storyline. Unfortunately for Mikey, though, every great story must have an end, and the ending to this one would happen in December of 1995 when he dropped the gold back to the Sandman. But because his run on top had been such a success, it meant he'd always have a spot on the roster after that, with him continuing to be a regular with the company on and off, all the way up until it closed its doors in 2001. Of course, by the time those latter days came around, though, ECW was beginning to struggle to keep things afloat in the wake of rising competition from the WWF and WCW. And that's exactly why it needed another great storyline to help them out, a storyline which happened in 1999 and is our next entry, the takeover of Cyrus the Virus and the Network. For some backstory here, by the time 1999 came around, Extreme Championship Wrestling had earned a weekly TV slot on TNN. But this came with a lot of network notes about what Paul Heyman could and couldn't get away with, causing him to grow increasingly frustrated. So, in order to vent these frustrations, he would create a character which would represent the network on screen, one which would go by the name of Cyrus the Virus. And that moniker is a reference to the character of the same name from the Nicolas Cage cult classic Con Air. When it came to this Cyrus though, his focus was on constantly providing notes for the on-air ECW product, something which caused him to become a mega heel in the eyes of fans. So it was then that when Cyrus the Virus eventually gained power as an official authority figure, it riled up fans to no end. And this became doubly true when he formed his own stable around him, a stable which, perhaps predictably, would go on to become known as the Network. But it wasn't suits from TNN who were present here. No, instead it was wrestlers like Tajiri, Steve Corino, and Rhino. And in the case of the latter two, their associations with Cyrus would see them go all the way to the top, as it was in November of 2000 that Steve Corino became the ECW World Champion, and in January of 2001 that Rhino did the same. Sadly though, before this angle could fully reach its conclusion, the doors of Extreme Championship Wrestling would close when the company went bankrupt and had to be sold off to Vince McMahon. And by the time the brand was resurrected again in the mid-2000s under a new incarnation, Don Callis would no longer be there to get involved. But even if it didn't end the way it should have, the Cyrus the Virus and the network takeover of the promotion was one of the best stories they ever did, and one of the shining lights of those last few months. That said, for as great as it will never be as well regarded as our next subject, another of the greatest stories ECW's ever told, the night Tommy Dreamer became Extreme. Yes, if there was ever a moment that defined what Extreme Championship Wrestling was, then this was it. And that's because it involved the very heart and soul of the company fully rising to the occasion for the first time. What was the story here exactly? Well, it was that for the first year or so of his time over in Philly, Tommy Dreamer would never be fully accepted by fans, as they saw him as being a little too clean cut. Obviously then, things were different for him back then, and if he wanted to be accepted in this new promotion, he was going to have to take drastic action and prove he was hardcore enough to belong there. Luckily for him then, the opportunity to do just this would come along when, in 1994, he began feuding with the Sandman. Why was this the perfect opportunity for Tommy to prove his hardcore credentials? Well, because early on during their feud, the two rivals would take part in a Singapore cane match, with the rule to this one being that the loser had to take 10 lashes across the back with a Singapore cane. And so it was then that after losing the bout, Dreamer would be forced to stand in the middle of the ring and take the lashes. But rather than cry about it, he instead shocked everyone by embracing the pain and even asking for more, with this leading to him finally being accepted by the Philly faithful as one of them. Because while you can fake a lot of things in wrestling, one thing you most certainly cannot fake is being hit across the back repeatedly with bamboo sticks. Really, you could call this Tommy Dreamer's origin story in many ways, because after it was over and audiences suddenly became aware he was far more than just a pretty boy, they'd be all in on him as their guy. And this allowed him to morph into the innovator of violence, the beating heart of everything ECW was trying to do back in the mid-90s. So much would he fill this role, in fact, even to this day, people tend to think of him first when they think of Paul Heyman's old roster. Well, they think of Tommy and someone else. Someone who is a part of a feud that makes up our next great ECW storyline. And in case you haven't guessed already, we're talking about Rob Van Dam and his memorable program with Jerry Lynn. Now, sometimes a wrestling storyline is filled with soap opera-esque twists and turns, as was the case with Tommy Dreamer and Raven, or if you're a more modern fan, something like The Bloodline. Sometimes, though, a great storyline can just be about two phenomenal wrestlers stepping into the ring with one another and finding out who's the best. And when it comes to such angles happening in ECW, there's no better example than the trilogy of matches which took place between Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn in 1999 across 3 separate shows, namely Living Dangerously, Hardcore Heaven, and an episode of ECW on TNN in September. Sure, there were other times the pair met as well, but these 3 are generally seen as the high watermark. Why is that? Well, because they are the high watermark in that they gave us some of the best and most innovative wrestling to be found in North America during that era. Yes, if you were a tape trader back in the day, then this was a series you were probably well aware of, and which you'd probably shelled out some money for, as it was all the rage amongst those circles. And what made it all the more appealing was the fact that each match was for RVD's television title. Needless to say then, this meant Rob would win round 1 after going hard with his opponent for just over 21 minutes. And it also meant he'd sneak out a victory in the second one too, after around 26 minutes of action. Not that this should suggest that Jerry Lynn wasn't great in these matches or anything though. No, he was keeping up with the champ step for step. The only problem was that no matter how good he was, no matter what he did, he just couldn't get that elusive win. And this meant that when that third bout ended with no one winning, but things instead going to a no contest, it allowed the Minnesotan a small sense of victory, as at least this time, he hadn't been beaten again. Sure, he hadn't won the title, but this was never really about the title. Rather, it was about proving who was the best in the ring, as all great wrestling storylines ultimately are. Hell, there was also an element to this in our next great ECW story too, the one that centered around the family drama of the Dudley Clan, as it featured little Spike Dudley feuding with the rest of the crew. That's right, back in the day, a traveling salesman by the name of Big Daddy Dudley met a lot of different women on his travels and fathered a lot of children, and these children would all later come together to form the Dudley family, a wrestling stable made up of names like Bubba Ray Dudley, Devon Dudley, Sign Guy Dudley, Dances with Dudley, Chubby Dudley, Big Dick Dudley, Snot Dudley, and Dudley Dudley. Of course, while all these children were outcasts though, even they looked down upon the runt of the litter, little Spike Dudley, and this regularly led to him being bullied by his own, particularly Bubba Ray. Obviously then, someone can only take so much of this kind of thing, and so it was that when Bubba Ray and Devon broke off from the rest of the family to form a powerhouse tag team act by delivering a 3D to Spike, he'd spend the rest of his time with that promotion, locked into a bitter feud with them as he sought his revenge. Yes, like with the story of Mikey Whi, this was a true underdog story, as it saw a diminutive fan favorite have to overcome the odds. The only difference this time though was that the odds the runt of the Dudley litter was having to overcome here wasn't winning the world title, rather it was simply getting the better of his two big bully brothers. And luckily for him, he was able to do just that, with a variety of different partners over the months and years, which ranged from Tommy Dreamer to the Sandman. Sure, there would be other business that little Spike Dudley had to take care of during this time too, but in the end, the situation always managed to circle back around to the feud between him and both Bubba Ray and Devon. And that all arguably reached its climax in the summer of 1999 when, on two separate occasions while partnering up with Balls Mahoney, Spike would be able to defeat the Dudley Boys to win the ECW tag team titles, with these two incidences marking the only time he ever won gold in that particular company. And this solidified it as one of ECW's great storylines. But then the same could be said about every other storyline we've looked at today, as they each are perfect examples of exactly why people watched and loved that company so much back in the day, and why it was able to change the wrestling world so much forever thereafter.